All right, friends, we're going to go ahead and get started for tonight just to be respectful of everyone's time. So thanks for those of you who came out this evening, and if you're watching us online later, hi, thanks for tuning in. So just tonight I want to start out by doing some introductions. We do have here in the audience myself, I'm Shannon Brown, I'm the Supervisor of Special Education for the district. Leah Ryder is the Director of Special Education for the district. John Nolan is our Assistant Superintendent. And Cliff Beaver is here, the principal of Pocopson Elementary School. We also have some Patton Middle School teacher representation this evening, so woo, good job, guys. And then, of course, we have parents and some community members who are here to speak, and we'll get to that in just one second. And then we have Andy Faust, who is from Sweet Stevens, Katz and Williams, who is going to be our main guest speaker this evening. We do have two other mini guest speakers who are going to come up and talk for just a second as well. I just wanted to go through a few announcements quick. Hopefully everyone grabbed an agenda. The usual reminders are on there. Our next meeting is February 8th. We are going to be talking about wellness, health, and fitness. Pat Crater, who is our athletic director, is that his title? Supervisor of Athletics, thank you, will be here. And also Doug Nakashima, who is from the Kennett YMCA, will be here. And so they will be presenting on wellness, health, and fitness for students with disabilities. So that'll be a very informative session. So just wanted to get that out there. Also wanted to remind you that on our website, which hopefully you got a handy dandy pen or you have memorized our website by now.
This one's mine now.
You can't have that one. We are posting everything on there. I just wanted to remind everyone the speaker series is posted and it's still up from last year, so you can see all of the topics from last year. You just click on them in the video's length, and over here are the links for this year, the topics that we've done. So if you miss one, you can log in and watch it online. We also are trying to keep the community resources page up to date. Yes, I know there's old pictures from last year's community resource fair. Leah was just giving me a hard time about taking those down. I said they make me happy. But underneath is all the updated, and I actually just got a few new emails this week, so I'm going to update some more with different activities and resources that are out there for you. So please remember to check that. Also, your school parent liaisons, if you want to talk to someone in one of your buildings, are here. These are all parents of students with special needs in each of the building that have been sort of mini trained and are willing to be your voice if you would like a voice in your building. Let me think. Oh, and the next advisory committee meeting is not until May 10th, so we have a little time until that one. But if you would like to be part of the advisory committee, you're always welcome, and the next meeting is May 10th. One other announcement that's not on there, we are working on our special education plan as a district. We do it every 3 years, and so we are about to have, I think in February, a community and district partnership meeting, and we're looking for parent input. So if you're a parent and you're interested in participating in that, if you want to let us know tonight or if you want to send us an email later, we'd be happy to have you. Obviously, you're one of our core groups of parents, so we'd certainly like to have your input in that plan. I think that's everything. Okay, so then we have two mini speakers. Sue, do you want to come up first? Sue Takaro is here, and she's going to talk to us about her parent coaching. And there are she brought brochures. If you didn't get to grab one, they're over on the table.
This is close enough.
Good enough for a mini speaker.
All right. I'm Sue DeCaro, and I'm a former parent in the district and still very much involved in the district from many different avenues, but I'm a parent coach and educator. And my work is really helping parents to navigate some of the challenges that they have in raising children. And so one of the things that I do is parents with children who may be struggling academically or have some special needs that they have that they're working on with the school district, sometimes parents need help too. Because let's face it, there's a lot of energy that goes into supporting our children no matter what challenges they're going through. Raising kids is really difficult in today's world. So with that being said, I do a lot of education as well. I'm a big believer in consciousness in our parenting and consciousness in our living and mindfulness. And so I do speaking engagements, workshops, as well as webinars online to help parents to learn these various tools and techniques in solving problems and dealing with challenges in their home. So that's a little bit about me. I struggled as well in raising my children and really feel that this is my calling and passion to help other parents as they move through various challenges. My kids are young adults now. So
great. Did anyone have any questions for Sue? And Sue may or may not hang out for the whole meeting, but I believe your contact info was on
My
here.
phone number, email are on there. You know, if you have any questions about my services or anything that I do, or you just want to chat for a few minutes, feel free to pick up the phone and give me a call, or send me an email and we can schedule a time where we can spend some time talking. But I am more than happy to have a consultation and chat and try to help or understand whatever it is you might be experiencing.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue.
Thank you.
All right, and next we have Natalie from Child and Family Focus here. She too wanted to share a little bit of information with our parent group. And Natalie brought business cards, right, that she can leave a couple for us on the table if you're interested in catching up with her.
Hi everyone, I'm Natalie Cochran. I am the Chester County Respite Coordinator with Child and Family Focus. We are a mental health service agency. We serve a whole bunch of counties in the area, but I'm here kind of to talk about our Chester County Respite Program. We provide hourly in-home care for children who have mental health needs, ages 3 to 21. The provider goes into the family's home for about 12 hours a month for 6 months, so that the parents can go out and get a break. It's a program obviously for the kids, but it's really designed for the parents. So I feel like I forget everything when I get up here, but the children must have currently be receiving mental health services, so that's a qualifier, and they have to be MA eligible. Let's see, what questions do you guys have?
When you say mental health services, are you speaking psychiatric, psychological, PT, OT? How do you define that?
So some examples like BHRS, like wraparound services, TSS, BSC, mobile therapist, outpatient services, med management.
If a student is just in, say, emotional support, would that qualify them?
It may. We kind of take it on a case-by-case basis, and, we try to make it work for every family that needs it. We're just kind of, our program is funded through the county, so that is where they kind of draw the line. If they are not receiving mental health services, then they're not, qualified. So,
Okay.
Any other questions for me?
Does Child and Family Focus offer wraparound as well?
We do. Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
So the two are not connected.
Respite and wraparound. I mean, we're all under CFF, Child and Family Focus, but we're not, the same program.
But the people who would be doing respite.
Oh, no, correct, right,
People that were already familiar with your child.
correct. A lot of our providers that, provide the respite for the families are TSSs, BSCs, teachers, aides. They work in this field already, so that's kind of a plug that I'd like to put out there. If you know of anyone in your classrooms, in your community, maybe your own college kids that might want to, gain some experience in the field, send them my way, because we are always looking for providers as well. And the best providers come from this kind of background. So, yeah.
So do you accept Medicaid, CHIP? How
It
is this
doesn't go
service?
through insurance. It's funded through the county. So you just have to be MA eligible.
So is there any way that if you do not receive, you're not MA eligible, is there a way that you can be privately hired?
I don't believe so through our program.
Good questions.
Any other questions?
Well, thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
information,
I'll leave my
Natalie.
business cards for you. You can feel free to contact me with any questions.
Awesome. All right, so now we'll turn it over to Andy Faust, and he's going to talk about the parents' role in an IEP meeting and maybe some other fun things.
Well, yeah, probably some other fun things too. That's a pretty narrow topic, but we can certainly start with that idea. First of all, a little bit about me, because I am a lawyer and I like to talk about myself. I have represented public schools exclusively for the span of my 32-year career, including this district. I started representing this district back in the late 1980s. and have seen it grow and change over a long period of time. As I have seen, special education law, and education itself changed significantly since the mid-1980s. We've really grown a lot in the educational community in the way that we look at children with disabilities, the way we integrate children with disabilities, the degree of disabling condition that we accommodate in regular public schools has really shifted. When I started practicing law in the mid-1980s, it wasn't unusual to see the vast majority of kids with any degree of significant disability educated in church basements and educational centers operated by intermediate units. It really has been a sign of significant progress in our society and our law and this state in particular, and including this district in particular, that more and more kids are accommodated in public schools. We really have risen to quite a challenge that the law has laid out for us as it has evolved over these years. My firm represents school districts all over the Commonwealth. We represent about 200 school districts. And I employ 10 lawyers who dedicate all of their practice to special education and student-related civil rights issues. So that should give you some sense of the magnitude of this area of practice, how much need there is just to help educators navigate the very complex federal and state law that governs the rights of kids with disabilities. It's quite a myriad of requirements, and every day we're answering questions on the phone about every conceivable possible aspect of educating a child with a disability, because there are just so many regulations in the hundreds of pages of federal regulations that could be potentially applicable that require that kind of navigation. So we're not just representing school districts in disputes with parents. In fact, I would say that's probably the minority of what we do. What we're trying to do is help educators, implement this law with fidelity and as it was intended to be implemented. So that's I like to think of that as more what we do than get involved in disputes. I will say that as I have a different perspective on special education than perhaps just as a lawyer representing public schools. When I had been practicing law for about a dozen years, so about 20 years ago, my oldest son was identified with a learning disability by our school district of residence at the time, the Central Bucks School District up in Bucks County. And he received special education for his entire educational career. So I found myself, after 12 years of practicing law, helping school districts with the development of IEPs and with the fine points of writing evaluation reports and reevaluation reports, actually sitting down with a team of educators and working on my own child's IEP, and I was completely useless in that process, which really stunned me. It surprised me how, when you are sitting as a parent at the table, how dumbstruck you can be, how tied up you can get with the emotion and the love and the intimate knowledge you have of your own child, and how that deprives you of the vocabulary that as a lawyer you might otherwise be able to bring to the table. So I certainly do appreciate, from sort of both sides of the inquiry, what being a parent and participating fully in the IEP process is like. And I had some pretty well-staffed IEP team meetings, even though I was a really nice parent. I never gave anybody any problems, but for some reason I always had half dozen educators sitting at the table. I'm not sure why that was. All right, so the first mission, I guess, is to talk a little bit about the parents' role at the IEP. And, I am assuming the parents who are sitting here, first of all, that you are all already veterans of that process, that you certainly understand the basic nuts and bolts of what an IEP team meeting is. You always, of course, have the parent rights notice that you can resort to. A few years ago, there was a Law Journal article published looking at, of all things, the readability levels of the various parent rights notices that all 50 states have issued under the IDEA. And some states do a pretty good job. Their readability levels are at the 7th, 8th, 9th grade level. Pennsylvania, postgraduate. So while we constantly hand this thing to you, and we expect you to read it and, and inform yourself of your rights. I would suggest to you that it's not always going to be that easy to decipher that huge body of information that is in that parent rights letter. And that's why you have, a team of professionals sitting at that table. They should be asked questions. You should feel free to ask them to interpret what all of that means for you. In the first instance, they are your partners and your collaborators. They're the people who you should go to first and ask for clarification, because God knows, as a lawyer who has done this for my entire career, I fall asleep get about halfway through that parent rights notice. It's just not that decipherable. But we know that the IEPT meeting is supposed to be a process by which, the child, first of all, the child's needs are, maintained as the center of focus, and everybody is heard. So it is supposed to be a collaborative process. And really, it doesn't work if everybody there isn't talking. One of the worst things that I think can happen, and I unfortunately see this a lot as a lawyer, every once in a while I'll have to attend an IEPT meeting for somebody other than my own child. My own child is 27 years old, so I'm not attending IEPT meetings for him anymore. But, every once in a while I attend an IEPT meeting as a lawyer because a parent has requested that their own lawyer be present. And I have to tell you, there's nothing that shuts people up quite like the presence of lawyers in a room. We're very used to not, people staring at us and not talking to us. And that effect, is not a good one, right? Because I'm used to sitting at an IEPT meeting, talking to my fellow lawyer across the table and not hearing what teachers and parents and therapists and others have to say about this child. And that's not productive. It's not a helpful process. It's always better when people feel comfortable enough and passionate enough and invested enough that they are willing to say anything that they feel is important, to share with the team. That they don't feel they need to edit or hold back any information about their child. And that goes for teachers too. Teachers should feel empowered to speak the truth, to talk about what it's like to educate your child every day in the classroom, what they're encountering, what challenges they are facing, and what advice you might have about how to handle the changes that children inevitably show, day to day, week to week, and month to month. So I cannot encourage loudly enough, that people speak openly and frankly to each other at IEPT meetings, because that's what the parent's role at an IEPT meeting is. It really is just that simple. I think a lot of folks think, wrongly, that an IEPT meeting is a democratic process, that at some point, once everybody has spoken and said their piece, there's going to be a vote. So there'll be a show of hands. How many people say the child should have 2 sessions of speech and language therapy a week for 45 minutes each? How many say it should be 3 for 50 minutes each? And we're going to vote. But that's not the way it works. After everybody has expressed their opinions, ultimately, the content of that IEP has to be determined by the entity whose name appears at the very top of that IEP, and that is going to be the school district, right? It is the IEP that's created, that's generated from the IEP process, is the school district's, in this case the Unionville-Chadds Ford School District's proposal for your child, right? It's their proposal for your child. So everybody's heard, but ultimately the district, usually in the person of the LEA representative, the local educational agency representative, or the person of the case manager, ultimately decides this is the way the goal will be worded, this is how many sessions of speech therapy we're going to have a week, this is how much learning support we're going to be offering, etc. The process, though, anticipates that we're not always going to agree, right? That we've all talked, we've all had our opportunity to provide input, but there may be points at which we're simply not going to agree. I absolutely believe my child needs those 3 sessions of speech and language therapy. I disagree with this 2-session proposal that I've just been handed, despite my most passionate advocacy to the contrary. There are lots of ways that the law affords us to deal with our differences, right? So you'll notice right up front on the notice that you are given with every IEP that cumbersome document known as a Notice of Recommended Educational Placement, NOREP, that you as parents are given 3 options for dealing with your differences. And that list of options doesn't even comprise all the options that you have. But the first option up there, one that has been part of our prior notice to parents, our NOREP, since 1976, is I request an informal meeting. And I would suggest to you that that is always the best first step, right? It is always the best first step to sit down face to face with a district decision maker. Because when you request that informal meeting, you're now pushing aside all of those team members who've already talked and collaborated and spoken about your child, and you are now looking eye to eye, face to face at a district administrator, and you are given an opportunity to express your concerns, to talk about why you believe what you think should be in that program should be in it. And that administrator has an opportunity to make a decision free of the sort of immediacy that teachers and related service providers and even LEA representatives sometimes bring to IEPT meetings. So it's always a good idea to get that fresh conversation, often with a fresh face, somebody who has not been participating in the conversation up until now, somebody who has a little bit of distance from the day in and day out education of your child. So requesting a meeting is always a good idea. Another option that's available, short of a due process hearing, is mediation. Mediation is also a discussion with district decision makers who have the opportunity to make a decision other than what the IEP team has decided. The difference between mediation and an informal conference is there is a trained mediator present as well. So we're inviting a guest to the table. And sometimes when emotions are high and we feel that we can't get any further in our direct discussions with people from the district, sometimes having that person in the room, that third party who is not associated with the district, who is sworn to impartiality, who will treat the conversation as completely confidential, is a good idea. Here in Pennsylvania, we have a very vigorous mediation program. It's mandated by federal law, but our program in Pennsylvania is one of the leading programs in the nation in terms of the frequency of use and in terms of its success rate. So fully 95% of the cases where the parties agree to go to mediation resolve amicably with one agreement or another. These agreements seldom please everybody entirely, right? That's the nature of an agreement. Somebody gives a little, another person gives a little. The result is a hash work that isn't necessarily what would have been optimal to any participant in the discussion. That's the nature of compromise. But mediation is often a very effective way of bringing a dispute to a calm and peaceful ending. But ultimately, there is also the opportunity to go to a due process hearing. And that is your right as a parent to demand the opportunity to present actual evidence to an impartial decision maker as to why you believe what you want for your child is the right way to go. Hearing officer is, as is a mediator, sworn to impartiality, but will render through a formal adjudicative process a decision that will be legally binding on the school district and on you about your child's needs. Now, I wouldn't discourage anybody from going to a due process hearing. I make my living representing school districts in due process, as do the 10 lawyers in my firm who do this kind of work. So it's certainly fruitful for me that there's plenty of discord in the kingdom. But I will tell you that a due process hearing has to be the least favored way to deal with a dispute, right? Because a due process hearing involves direct confrontation, and it involves bringing a third party in who does not know your child, who does not have the intimate day in and day out information from the classroom, who does not have the intimate familiarity that only a parent can have. This is going to be a person with some considerable distance. And unlike the mediator, this person is going to make a legally binding decision about your child. It is almost certain that that decision will not satisfy anybody who participated in that process. I doing this for 32 years, I can tell you that I seldom have recognized the child that the hearing officer describes in their decision. And talking to many, many parents who've been through due process hearings, I think they would say the same thing. You know, this hearing officer made certain conclusions and certain findings about my kid from that lofty height at which they're sitting, from that great distance from the classroom from which they're perceiving reality. And quite frankly, I don't think they got it all right. But nonetheless, here's the decision. Here's what this person from that distance is deciding for us, for all of us, for you as parents, for the school district. The whole community of people most intimately familiar with this child now has had a solution imposed from some great distance. So it's not that a due process hearing sometimes isn't inevitable and sometimes necessary to resolve disputes, but it really should be the last step, not the first step that we're taking in an effort to come to some common ground. Now, there are other processes that are also available under Pennsylvania law for amicable resolution. We have in Pennsylvania innovated a process of mediated IEP team meetings. So the Office for Dispute Resolution here in Pennsylvania, which is responsible for our hearing system and our mediation system, will, if requested by both parties, appoint an impartial mediator-like individual, but usually somebody with educational expertise, to attend an IEP team meeting and actually help the parties with the discussion. But this is going to be, unlike a mediation or a due process hearing, much more fine-grained. It's going to be about how that goal should be worded, which items of specially designed instruction should be in that IEP, et cetera. So it's a very productive way, and again, something with a very high success rate available to parents and school folk here in Pennsylvania that is also worth looking at. If things are at loggerheads, you're not sure where to go or how to resolve this dispute, the mediated IEP process is also an option available to us here in Pennsylvania. So again, I emphasize these forms of dispute resolution because we do have to understand that the IEP process is not a democratic one. It's not going to necessarily resolve with everybody, at a consensus point. It's built, the whole law around IEP development is built on the idea that there may very well be a point at which a dispute exists because the district which owns that IEP and is proposing it for your child is proposing something with which you disagree. Right? Now, I know you have to be, this knowledgeable group sitting here, pretty familiar with the bowels of an IEP. I want to suggest to you that, and I found this as a parent, knowing very well legally, what the IEP is, what its contents are, the process of walking through an IEP can be very frustrating. It can be very frustrating because, as a parent, I am very anxious about certain bottom lines, right? I want to know where my child is going to be. How much special education is my kid going to get? How much of that related service that my child depends on is my child going to get? And all of that stuff is inconveniently positioned at the back of the IEP. There's a whole lot of stuff we're supposed to be talking about before we get there. So first and foremost, we need to figure out where your child is instructionally. And that requires an in-depth analysis of your child's present levels of academic and functional performance, right? So that comes first, and logically so, right? You can't decide where you're going or how you're going to get there if you don't know where you are, right? So the process necessarily starts with that discussion. And the law requires that we consider two things distinctly: academic performance, your child's reading, written language, and math levels, but also functional performance, because many kids with disabilities are struggling with things that are not explicitly taught in the curriculum, right? What we explicitly teach in the curriculum are academic-related skills. But with what kids with disabilities often struggle with, my own child struggled with, might be considered more functional in nature or executive functional in nature. My child, for example, was identified back in the 1990s with an attention deficit disorder. I think today, in our more sophisticated age, we would have said my child had an executive functioning disorder. His working memory, as tested on intelligence tests, was very low compared to his verbal reasoning and other intelligence components. And that meant that there were going to be some real problems with the way that my child approached all kinds of learning tasks, right? It meant that in learning to decode, he was going to have trouble holding in his working memory, his short-term memory, what he already knew about the sounds of spoken English and the corresponding symbols, and then be able to combine new symbols to the existing ones, and then ultimately be able to blend those into words. It was a difficult process for somebody with limited working memory. So he was going to require a much more intensive reading approach. But he also needed to learn how to initiate tasks, sustain attention to tasks, to manage time, to organize his materials, all of which were executive functioning issues that were related, part and parcel, to his working memory deficits, right? So we have to look at your child both as an academic entity, how are they reading, how are they writing, but also as a functional entity. What is it that may be impairing not just how they read and write, but how they approach the learning process in general, right? So both aspects of present levels are really important to discuss. Now, another thing that is really critical, and particularly here in Pennsylvania for reasons that I will explain in a minute, is learning-related behavior. When we think of behavior, when somebody says that a child has learning interfering behavior, we tend to think, oh, that's a bad kid. That's a kid who's always disruptive. That's a kid who's always, ensnared in the disciplinary process. But learning interfering behavior, the way it's defined in the law, could mean behavior that's interfering exclusively with the learning of the child. Not anybody else, not the teacher, just the child. So a child who is very anxious, a child who is depressed, a child who's withdrawn or disengaged from the learning process, could be exhibiting learning interfering behavior. They may be withholding themselves from cooperative learning with their peers in the classroom. They may not even be attending. They may withhold themselves from school. You may struggle with them every morning, getting them up and out the door. These are learning interfering behaviors, even if the child is not, once they're in school, doing bad things that get them in trouble. Under the law, we're required to address learning interfering behavior the same way we're required to address reading skill deficits or writing deficits. We're required to treat them as a skills deficit. Just like when a child is struggling to decode, they're in 5th, 6th grade, and kids their age have already exploded the code. They're reading accurately and fluently. They're now reading entirely for meaning. We're not teaching them decoding anymore. Many kids with disabilities need to be explicitly taught and reinforced those basic decoding strategies that we're teaching most kids in 1st and 2nd grade. The same is true with behavior. The difference is, with behavior, we don't teach it at all in the curriculum, right? We expect by nature and nurture that kids will have developed the coping strategies, the anxiety management strategies, the behavioral control to function appropriately in an academic setting. But many kids with disabilities, my own child with his executive functioning disorders, don't have those skills developed. Well, our job as educators is to teach those skills. So a child, take my own again, with an executive functioning disorder, with a attention deficit disorder, if you were to have said to my child when he was in 1st grade, Alex, I was just watching you in the classroom, and your eyes were all over the place. You clearly were not paying attention to your teacher. He would have said to me, yes, I was. I heard everything she said. And would have argued with me, right? Because Alex didn't have a clue that he was off task, or what off-task behavior looks like, or what on-task behavior looked like. None of that was apparent to him, right? So what did he need to learn? He needed to learn, first of all, to know the sorts of activities that made him go off task. He needed to learn what his off-task behavior looks like. And he needed to learn what on-task expectations are. All of that had to be explicitly taught to him. And the same is true of kids with all kinds of learning interfering behavior. A child who is anxious about school and is withholding themselves from learning because of that anxiety may need to learn the sorts of things that are triggering anxiety and what anxiety looks like and feels like in them. They may not be aware of that. It's awfully hard to teach a child how to cope with something that they're not even aware of, right? So the first thing we have to do is teach kids, just like we teach them to decode, teach them explicitly and directly to recognize, what their anxiety looks like and feels like. Teach them to be able to rate the level of their anxiety so that they know the difference between a normal level of anxiety, the sort that we all feel at times, and the high level of anxiety that they're responding to stimuli with. And then, once they are able to self-monitor and be self-aware, to then teach them strategies, productive strategies, to deal with that anxiety. The sorts of things, again, that by nature and nurture just come naturally to most of us. We may be required to explicitly teach to kids with disabilities. So that's all about functional levels of performance. Where is your child right now? What is your child struggling with? It's necessary that we figure that out before we then go on to talk about the next thing in the IEP, which are your child's goals. Right? So we write goals in an IEP because your child needs to learn something that isn't targeted in the general curriculum at grade level. Right? There's a lot of talk these days about goals being aligned with grade level standards. Every once in a while you'll read some literature about, standards aligned goals. But that's a bunch of nonsense. What the law expects is that we write goals targeting outcomes that are different than the outcomes of the general curriculum. If your child's capable of acquiring the outcomes of the general curriculum, if your child is in 9th grade and they teach algebra in 9th grade, we wouldn't write an algebra goal for your child because the regular classroom would be the source of those outcomes and that teaching. But if your child was in 9th grade and was still reading at a 3rd grade level, we would teach decoding and comprehension strategies to your child at that 3rd grade level. And we would write goals defining the outcomes of that instruction because it wouldn't be defined in the curriculum at 9th grade. So that's what goals are about, defining what the differentiated or special instruction outcomes are going to be for your child. And then we move to specially designed instruction and program modifications. Specially designed instruction and program modifications serve two purposes. First, the attainment of the goals that we've just written, which is why we write the goals first, right? Write the goals first, and then figure out, based on where your child is now and where we want your child to be a year from now, because that's what the goal defines, how we're going to get your child there. So specially designed instruction, first and foremost, is about getting your child to those endpoints, right? The second purpose of specially designed instruction is to ensure that while we're providing all of that differentiated instruction to get to those differentiated goals and outcomes, we're also maximizing the extent to which your child is participating in the regular classroom and the general curriculum. Because one thing the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the federal law that governs special education, requires is that we maximize integration. And sometimes the words for maximize integration are least restrictive environment. We ensure that your child is being educated in the least restrictive possible environment. That means the environment that looks as much as possible exactly like the environment where kids your child's age are being educated. Regular classrooms, pursuing the general curriculum that everybody else is pursuing. So one of the functions of specially designed instruction and program modifications is ensuring that that classroom is as accessible to your child as it possibly can be. Right? So it's only once we've had this discussion of what your child's unique learning outcomes are going to be and unique instruction will be, and how we're going to modify and adapt the regular classroom, do we get to the ultimate discussion, which is how and where are we going to do this? Does your child need time in a special education classroom? If so, what kind of special education classroom? If your child is learning replacement behaviors, perhaps it's an emotional support classroom, maybe it's an autistic support classroom. If your child has predominantly academic outcomes, perhaps it's a learning support classroom or a life skills classroom. So we have to figure out what type of special education, how much of that special education, but we can only figure that out once we've talked about what those goals are and what that specially designed instruction is going to be. So it does sometimes require sitting on your hands and being patient as we're going through those present levels, those goals, those specially designed instruction and program modifications before we get to sort of the money discussion, the where, the how, the who, that comes at the very end of the IEP. The IEP is supposed to be about what is absolutely necessary for your child to learn. I think sometimes we forget that. Teachers and parents together forget that. And we start talking about what a child would benefit from. My child would benefit from having a one-on-one aid all day, every day. My child would benefit from having more time with a speech and language therapist, time with a special educator. Benefit is not the standard that the law requires us to apply, much as we would like to think so. It's not about what's necessary for you to benefit, any more than that discussion would be relevant to me, for example. I think I would benefit from having a new sports car, but that doesn't mean I'm going to get one. The question that we're asking at an IEP team meeting is, what does your child need? What is, to use the Latin, because we lawyers use a lot of Latin, what is the sine qua non, the without which not, for your child? That means that when we're looking at all of that specially designed instruction, we really should be looking at a relatively short list that is described in great detail, right? Often when I get an IEP to review, what I see is page after page after page after page of specially designed instruction. It just goes on and on and on and on. Dozens and dozens of items, none of which is very clear, right? Highly structured environment, extended time for, long-term assignments, just all kinds of broad generalities. Nothing very specific. What do we mean by highly structured environment? What does that look like? What are the components of it? What do we mean by extended time? How much time? For what sorts of tasks? We don't describe with sufficient detail these things, and we have too much of it in there. The specially designed instruction should be a relatively short list because it's what your child absolutely needs to access instruction, to make progress toward their goals, but described with a fair amount of detail. You, as a parent who may not be a trained educator, should be able to read each item of specially designed instruction in your child's IEP and say, yeah, I get it. I know exactly what this teacher is going to do, right? It's sufficiently described here that I, as a layperson, understand. If I were to walk into my child's classroom, I could look at what was going on, hold up this IEP and say, yeah, it's happening or it's not, right? So you want clarity and you want some degree of brevity, right, in your specially designed instruction. I should have said this because as a lawyer, I will suck every atom of oxygen out of this room until you collapse. That I would really rather have this be interactive. So, yeah. I should have said that about 45 minutes ago, but I didn't. So please, I mean, I would invite you to just interrupt me if you have questions, or, you know, quite frankly, if I'm blathering on about something you already knew and you really don't need to know, please feel free to ask me a question about something you want to talk about. Yes,
I
ma'am.
have a question. When I came in, you were talking about due process and mediation.
Yes.
Well, I have to tell you, my son is the oldest who has the IEP, so I'm still learning as we go, and I feel like I have learned in the past 6 years much more, you know, by going through it, rather than, I talk to a lot of mothers or, you know, read about it, but it's, every child is so different.
Absolutely.
And they need different things. Let's say, it has happened so many times. We sign the IEP, we usually, like, always agree with them, because we think that they know the best as educators. But let's say a year passes by. It has happened more than one time. And I feel like we have felt like that last year was completely went wrong. He was in the wrong classroom. He shouldn't be in that classroom. So what do you do then? Like,
Right.
how do you, I mean, you can't bring the time back. That's the worst thing. I always tell the teachers that beginning of the year, time passes quickly, so
Right.
you really have to be, like, start with the right decisions.
Right.
Otherwise, it just passes like that. It's January right now.
But you know what?
It's
It's
May
and that's an excellent point. But you know, I go back to my own experience as somebody who really knows the law and really did when my child was first identified as disabled when he was in first grade. I was hopelessly clueless, you know, about what was being proposed for my child, and I wouldn't be surprised if, to a certain degree, and this is going to maybe unsettle you. For the entire membership of an IEP team, we are engaging in what is at best informed speculation. Because just as you said, every child is unique and different. Every child evolves and changes, literally by the week and month. You know that as a parent. So we're making a prediction, sitting down, say in June of any given year, about what might work next year with your child. And that's it. It's what might work. And in fact, the law specifically recognizes that. What the law tells us is that we're required to design an IEP that is reasonably calculated, not guaranteed, not a sure thing, right? I know. Reasonably calculated to enable your child to make meaningful educational progress. You know, so with that in mind, that really gets to, your question really raises a very important second role that a parent plays in this process, and that is monitor. You know, I tell educators this all the time. You cannot find yourself in a position where an entire year has gone by and you are sitting down at the annual review of a child's IEP, looking at your data and saying, wow, that was a really bad year. What are we going to do next year? It's too late to be having that conversation in June, right? But, you know, educators are busy. It isn't unusual for a learning support teacher to have 15, 20 kids on their caseload, and they're monitoring all these kids with all different goals and all different SDIs, and they do the best they can. But as a parent, you've got a singular focus, in your case, your oldest child, and the district is required on a quarterly basis to give you progress monitoring data, a summary of how your child is doing. Now, you may look at that and say, you know what, I don't understand this. This isn't giving me enough information. You need to talk to that teacher. Can you tell me more? Can you tell me what data you're relying on for this conclusion? Or you may look at those data and say, ooh, this doesn't look like a whole lot of progress. My child's word correct per minute rate was here, 3 months ago, and now it's just barely 2 or 3 more words now. I'm not so sure that's good progress. You have to have that conversation. Hold on. You have to have that conversation then, right? Not wait until June and say, boy, that was a terrible year. Any more than the teacher can have that revelation after a year. You as a parent can't wait and have that revelation after a whole year either, right? Since the whole thing is an experiment, it is a reasonable calculation. That reasonable calculation has to be tested against the evidence, like any good experiment is. And you have to pull up and change that experiment, alter the conditions sooner rather than later. Go ahead, you were going to say something.
I have a few questions, so you really have to listen to me. Let's say September starts. I'm always monitoring, like you said. I'm like more monitoring more than I should sometimes. Okay, it's November, and I kind of feel like I feel like he's not in the right school. Let's just say.
Oh, that's big for November.
So, what do you do?
I might have a little conversation about some fine tuning before I got to he's in the wrong school by November, but okay.
The thing is that he just started middle school.
Yeah.
So that is a jump. Like, we didn't know. Like, he was the first child. Like, I didn't know what middle school would bring. I'm just saying that. I'm not saying this happened. It's just, so in that scenario, what do you do? Like, do you go talk to that? Like, how do you bring that question up?
Sure. Well, okay. I mean, first of all, probably the worst transition that a child makes in their entire career, and I am using the word child generically, whether the child is disabled or not, is the middle school transition. Sorry, Pat, in middle school. But you specialize in the raging onset of adolescence. It's just a disastrous time, and on top of that, we are adding stressors that are exponentially greater than the stressors that existed even at the upper elementary school. Right? We are putting a child on a bell schedule with lots of different teachers, a lot more rigor. Even the way a child is learning at the elementary level, most learning is occurring in the classroom, and what's occurring in the home and the homework is supplemental. When we get to the secondary level, including middle school, most of the learning is occurring through independent reading, calculation, writing, and that is being reinforced in the classroom, not primarily provided in the classroom. So that's a huge shift in the educational model for a typically developing child. Add the fact that the child is freighted with some learning concerns, as my oldest child was, as your oldest child is. Now that middle school experience is really tough, and we start to see some overlay too, right? A child who was exclusively involved academically at the elementary level, they hit the middle school with all that social change occurring in the population and all that expectation, and they start to show some anxiety and frustration that they weren't showing when they were younger. So you need, as a parent, I needed as a parent, the perspective of people who see this happen all the time, right? Who watch kids age into middle school, into early adolescence, into all of that chaos all the time. Because these people have a better way of calibrating just how different your child's experience is. And they often also are acutely sensitive to how to deal with, the struggles that every child faces. And of course, the special ed teachers in the middle school are particularly attuned to how kids with disabilities approach these changes. So I wouldn't panic. I hear you say by November you've decided that your child needs another school. To me, that's a little premature. Okay. I would start having those conversations though. This doesn't appear to be working for my child. I'm really worried. He's showing some anxiety. He's very frustrated. He seems to be shutting down. Whatever the concern is, bring it to the team, because the team will talk about things that will make you feel better. And then we're going to ask whether what they've offered works, right? We're going to look at that second quarter progress report, third quarter progress report. Then we may make some bigger decisions, about whether things are working or something more drastic needs to happen.
Okay. The other question, I'm sorry if I'm the only one asking you.
That's okay.
The other question is, this will be the last one, I'm sure, about the data. How do you get the data out of the teachers? I feel like it has happened to me one time. I was asking the teacher about his reading level, and she waited until the last day before the summer school. Like, it was when the last day when school was ending at 1:30 or 2 o'clock. So she really waited the last day. And I was emailing
To create the data or to give you the data?
They never gave me the data.
No, okay.
quarterly progress, if it's reading that you're specifically worried about, have it written in. I want data every 2 weeks.
Right. And I think that's probably a reasonable interval. One thing about data, I've known over the years some families who are super data junkies, so they want data every day. They want to see data every day, and so the teachers are, they're coughing up data on a daily basis. The problem with data is that data wobbles. All data wobbles, right? If you were to, have a child read orally, to you every single day, that word correct per minute rate, which is, the metric that we typically use for oral reading, it's going to go up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down. So if you're just looking at those data every day, you're not getting a very accurate picture of what's going on. You have to look at data over time. So like a 2-week interval, that might make sense for a high frequency skill like reading, reading accuracy or reading fluency. Maybe a broader interval for something bigger like writing. A written product, we don't take as many samples of writing. It's usually a big product that the child is producing, maybe several sentences or a paragraph or whatever. So you might want data, monthly. And that's fine. I think that's a discussion you have to have. As an involved parent, I want to see a little bit more data, especially since you're obviously experiencing some concern about this middle school transition. By all means, sit down and ask for more data. And then the district will provide it to you. They will provide it to you. If you ask.
It has happened that they have not.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not
Well, it was an
talking
interesting
about
question.
this
How do I
school
get data from the teacher? I was all of a sudden, it felt like saying,
Yeah.
turn her upside down and shake her boots. Then it'll fall out. No, you have a discussion.
She wasn't talking about our district.
Yeah.
No, I'm not talking about it.
Yeah, but your point, I think the answer was a very good one, and that is the frequency of data sharing is an IEP team discussion that you can have.
Okay.
Just like almost anything else, any other concern you have is.
I just was part of one of those discussions today in an elementary IEP meeting.
Right.
We're doing more frequent data on a certain skill set.
Right. So, but remember, as a parent, you want the data. One thing that an educator immediately is going to detect, and I think rightly so, if somebody is saying, I want to know every single day about my child's work, I want you to give me data every single day, what they're going to detect there is not that you really are looking at your child's progress, but you're monitoring the teacher, and that doesn't help a relationship, right? So your data requests should be reasonable enough in their interval length that what you're actually seeing is growth or lack of growth in your child, not whether the teacher is doing their job. They're doing their job. You want to look at that, for that purpose. All right. Did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Possibly not to your satisfaction, but okay. All right. So I'm going to move on to another topic only because there was a rather big development, at least for those of us those wonks like me who, toil in the vineyards of public education every day. Last year, the United States Supreme Court decided a case interpreting the IDEA, the Federal Special Education Mandate. They don't do that often. The Supreme Court rules on the IDEA once every 5 or 6 years. I don't know why. I guess it's just not a topic that interests them that much or whatever. But last year, the Supreme Court went after the big issue. The big issue in special education is, what is appropriate progress for a kid? How do we know that the progress a child is making constitutes a free, appropriate public education? See, the problem with the IDEA is it uses all these really vague terms. Like a child has to have an IEP that's reasonably calculated to ensure meaningful progress. Well, what the heck does that mean? And how do we calibrate that? The only decision we had up until last year was decided way back in 1981 by the Supreme Court in a case called Rowley versus the Board of Education. And the interesting thing about the Rowley case was it concerned a child named Amy Rowley whose disability was that she was deaf. She was otherwise cognitively intact, a very capable learner. And she was educated pretty much all day, every day in the regular classroom. The only question in the Rowley case that the United States Supreme Court was presented with was, should Amy Rowley have a sign language interpreter in the classroom all day, every day, because her school district didn't make an interpreter available for all classes, made it available for certain core classes. But in other classes, Amy didn't have the benefit of that. She had to get by with her adequate but not great lip reading skills. And the problem was the parents said, hey, look, the standard should be under the IDEA, then known as the Education of the Handicapped Act, the standard should be that my child's access to education, the progress that they make in education, the opportunity that they have in the classroom should be exactly the same as a non-disabled peer. My child should be able to maximize her potential to the same extent that a completely hearing child would be able to, presented with the ordinary oral stimuli in a classroom. And the district argued, well, that's not necessarily true. All we're required to do under the IDEA, then known as the EHA, all we're required to do is ensure that there's a basic floor of opportunity. As long as Amy is accessing the classroom, even if the way she's accessing it isn't as optimal as her hearing peers, we've done our job. Well, the Supreme Court ultimately decided the case in favor of the district, and it concluded that the IDEA does not require that we maximize potential or maximize progress. It's not a guarantee that a child is going to have every opportunity that a non-disabled child is going to have. It is more of a floor of opportunity. So the fact that Amy was actually progressing from grade to grade, she was earning B's, A's, every once in a while she dipped to a C, but she was progressing grade to grade in the regular education classroom, was sufficient evidence that Amy was doing just fine, as far as the Supreme Court was concerned. That she could have done better with an interpreter full-time was irrelevant. So that was widely interpreted for years and years and years to establish a fairly low bar for special education programming. Some courts actually interpreted it as meaning that a child with a disability only had to make minimal progress, just the lowest level of progress possible. As long as they were eking out something above their baseline, the FAPE mandate, the Free Appropriate Public Education mandate, was satisfied. But the problem with the Amy Rowley case was, Amy was a child who was 100% of the time in the regular classroom, and most kids with disabilities in fact are spending at least some time in a special education classroom. And how we calibrate progress in a special education classroom can't be measured by the grades that we're getting or the fact that you're progressing from grade level to grade level. There has to be some different standard that would apply. So the courts, were very mixed up on this question. Some courts said, well, a child in a special ed classroom, a child with autism, a child with severe reading disability needs to only make minimal progress year to year, and we satisfied our obligation because that's essentially what the court said in Rowley. Other courts took a different view and said, no, the progress that's being made in special education programming has to be meaningful. It has to be meaningful in terms of what this child's potential is. So if a child with a reading disability has average intelligence, the potential to grow 1 year for every year in programming, then that child should be growing approximately a year for every year that they're receiving programming. It has to be meaningful, not just any old progress is going to do. Well, because the courts were in disagreement on that question, is it minimal progress? Is it meaningful progress? Is it maximal progress? The Supreme Court last year in a case called Andrew F. decided to take up that question. What is progress? What will satisfy the legal standard? And ultimately, the Andrew F. Court concluded that meaningful progress, progress that's more than just the bare minimum, is required by the IDEA. And moreover, the goals that we write for kids can't be lowball goals. They have to be challenging goals. They have to be goals that a child with a disability should be reaching for, but can attain given their potential, given their unique circumstances. Now, that's not a whole lot of guidance, but at least what it's saying to the world is the IDEA doesn't accept just chug along progress. It expects something that's meaningful given the child's potential. Now, I'll get you just a sec. In some places, that was a huge, shot over the bow. In the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit, which is way out in the Midwest, all school districts were judged based on the minimal progress standard. And Andrew F., which came out of that circuit, was a huge change for that jurisdiction. It really requires educators out there to up their game. Here, however, in Pennsylvania, we reside within the United States Circuit Court of Appeals for the 3rd Circuit. And the 3rd Circuit standard has always been meaningful progress. So educators here in Pennsylvania, for many, many years, the meaningful progress standard has been in place in the 3rd Circuit since the mid-1980s, have always had a higher standard for progress than other circuits have had. So this Andrew F. case, although it made headlines all over the place and there were suggestions that it really changed the game for special education and special educators, the Andrew F. decision here in Pennsylvania didn't really change much. And most of the courts that have looked at the case since have said that. They've said, Andrew F., not a big deal here. We've always expected educators to ensure that kids made meaningful educational progress, and we're still going to expect that as our outcome. We're not going to accept lowball goals. We're going to expect that goals are going to be challenging for the child based on that child's unique potential and needs.
So how in our district do we measure, what do we use as our measurement of potential? Is it,
Right.
Is it IQ? Is it, I've got a kid who is, like every other kid on the planet, has variable skills.
Right.
She's in learning support, she's in life skills, and she's in regular ed, and she's good at some things and not good at other. How do we measure what potential is?
That's why it's great to be the court, because the court can say broad, big things and not offer a whole lot of guidance. So what Andrew F. said is you have to look at multiple factors. So certainly the child's intelligence level is a factor, but intelligence is not necessarily destiny. And we know I've known in my career many kids who have what could be considered, intelligence measured in the intellectually disabled range, who are quite capable of rapid growth in certain areas, just, depending on what the area is. I've known kids who are in the gifted range who are so freighted with anxiety and other factors other than their intelligence that limit their learning capacity, that their growth is not going to be anywhere near what their intellectual capacity would suggest it should be. So every child has a unique array of factors that need to be looked at. The best evidence of what we should expect from a child is what the child has given in the past, right? So if we've measured a rate of growth in response to good quality instruction, it's always easy to talk about something like fluency. I keep using it as an example, but a child's word correct per minute rate, if it's grown 40 words correct per minute, if it grew that last year, it might be reasonable to expect that next year it'll grow somewhere in that range again, right? Because we have actual direct evidence from the child, rather than having to speculate from indirect things like the child's learning interfering behavior, their intelligence, and other factors that may influence growth. But absent actual experience, or even if we have experience but we're trying a new approach, we are left with those sort of indirect indicators like intelligence, like behavior, like the degree of learning disability that they're exhibiting on standardized tests and other things of that sort. It's not a precise science, much as we wish it would be. Okay.
We are getting near the end.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, if anybody have any other questions? I could go on and on. No? All right, well, thank you. I appreciate it. If anybody wants to ask anything of me with, outside the confines of the big meeting, feel free to come up. Understand, however, that I represent the school district.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Just a reminder, our next meeting is February 8th, and also if you're a parent and you're interested in providing input for the special ed plan, please let us know. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Ms.
Thanks for coming.